Many thanks to Aoife for her kind words, and I'm really thrilled to be here, and thank you too to the Galway Festival. It's a real honour to be here and to see Erin's wonderful show. So, Erin, can we just start off by, is that too thumpy?
It's
is
fine.
It all right?
I think it's fine.
Is it all right?
I think.
Tell me if it's too thumpy. Yeah, no? Good. So, Erin, can we start off with this show, this wonderful show is called Divining. And so how did that title come about, and how does it link these works here?
When Aoife and I started discussing doing an exhibition back here in Ireland, as she rightly said, it's my first time exhibiting in Ireland. My father was from Tullow, County Carlow, and obviously there's been, coming back here over my life at different periods. The first thing I sort of did almost mechanically when we started discussing possible titles was reach for my bookcase, and I came, it was a book of Seamus Heaney poems that came down straight away, and I opened it up, and the first page actually had an inscription from my father, my late father, who died in 1999. It was actually a gift to me in 1987, so that kind of felt sort of meant in some ways. And the first poem I turned to was a short poem called The Diviner, by Seamus Heaney. It's a very concrete little poem, as Heaney often is, quite concrete in his writing, about a water diviner waiting for that tug of the stick. And it sort of suddenly struck me that is in many ways a part of the process for many painters, but certainly for myself when I'm in the studio, particularly working as I do on the ground, on a horizontal plane. The space of the canvas becomes a ground and a place of almost labouring. But a lot of the way I working wet on wet, but again, it's probably true of most painters, however they work, is about being attentive to what's happening on the canvas, and to looking for those moments, those potentially fertile moments on the canvas, those moments where something is happening, something is almost alive. And so really that sense of the diviner felt like a very sort of serendipitous figure to have come across, as well as the other connections. The poem, of course, is called The Diviner, not Divining. That's for several reasons. I didn't go with The Diviner. Partly it sounds extremely pretentious, as titles go. But also, painting is a verb, and the way I paint these days, as process-driven as it is, and as wet on wet, is very much in the doing. So it felt important to me that it be the verb form, that it's in the action and in the doing. I've also been struggling very much recently with trying to finally learn Gaelic and grappling with Gaelic, and of course, in the Irish language, it is the verb that leads, always, the sentence. So that was yet another reason to go with the verb.
I think it's a good moment maybe to step back a bit and look at your beginnings as an artist, because your background, you didn't go to art school, you studied literature and art history at the Sorbonne. And so how did that study in words, in literature, in ideas, lead to you becoming a maker rather than a writer?
I'd argue that a writer is a maker.
Yeah, I know, I was about to say that.
I think it was a stepping away from words. I ended up actually not studying literature. I was supposed to be going to study literature, and the going to Paris straight out of school was to learn a foreign language, because I hadn't really studied another language. And I ended up very quickly deciding I wanted to stay in France and in Paris, which I long outstayed that sabbatical year. I stayed there for 26 years in the end. So, yeah, much outstayed, probably my welcome. But there was a question of switching. I ended up switching to art history and archaeology, which I studied at the Sorbonne. And obviously I studied that in French. There was a stepping away from, I obviously wasn't going to study English literature in France. So there was a sort of sidestep in that sense. Growing up, I'd always been both drawing and painting as well as writing. I'd always been, both felt the impulse to make and to create, at the same time been very torn between the two. As I was of a slightly academic bent, that was sort of the way I was encouraged. Really, after 4 years of sitting on those dusty benches in the Sorbonne looking at painting, there was an overriding impulse to paint. I was finding it more and more frustrating looking at painting and not painting myself. There was also, of course, by that point, the fact that I was in between two languages. I was living my life in French, which pretty much became my first language for a long time. So painting again was a sidestep into a more universal form of expression. There was also the fact that I was finding, even prior to that, I think I was finding the written language very complicated. There's something brilliantly precise about the word and about language, but it was something I was struggling with. I was finding it quite excruciating, quite embarrassing, that precision that there is in writing, whereas painting allowed something much more implicit rather than explicit. It's a vehicle of expression that is both very powerful and can be very immediate and very strong, and yet is, or can be, less explicit. And that is something that attracted me.
Yeah. And how did you're now sort of known as an abstract painter, and obviously we're going to talk about the word abstraction because it's a complicated concept, because it's often actually representing something. It's not as if it's just form and color. But originally you started out painting more figuratively, I think.
I did. I mean, that was partly the chip on the shoulder I had of not having gone to art school. They weren't really teaching painting at all in France at the time. They'd kind of thrown it out as a bourgeois construct post-68, and there was no way you could pick up a paintbrush in a French art school around that time. So I really decided, and it was clear to me by that point that I was coming to painting for oil paint in particular, that it was my love of late Titian and Soutine and Auerbach and that almost meta painting, that thing that it was as much about, you know, the paint and oil paint in particular as about any other subject. So there was that sense for me, but really there was the thing of both, no doubt, at a distance, looking back to what little painting I was seeing at the time, which was largely kind of School of London, the portrait and that tradition there, which itself had been very influenced actually by Paris post-war, Giacometti, you know, those sometimes sculptors who were painting, Fautrier as well as Giacometti, and Valse. But there was also that sense for me of needing to sort of both learn my medium, which at the time, probably contrary to today, looked like inevitably a very long thing. You know, those were the days where you didn't expect to be in a group show till the age of 40, and yeah, if you were lucky. Unlike, you know, today's sort of fast social media process and straight out and into things. But really it was about learning, looking at the face and thinking that's one of the most complex volumes there is, and if I can sort of master that, then I can, you know, it's a way of teaching myself to paint in quite a traditional way. I think it was also to do with that notion of paint being a vehicle of sort of both the memento mori and that sort of golem kind of thing as well, of trying to bring something alive. I was going through quite a lot of grief at the time. My brother had died, my father was ill. I was very much, I think, grasping at that sort of immortality as well as mortality, you know, that double-edged sword that there is within painting, of both accepting mortality while striving for immortality in a way. So portrait felt a logical place to start, and I did for 10 years pretty much work in that vein, until I realized that I was had painted myself into a corner. I was feeling very trapped by it. It was very repetitive, that I was actually growing more interested in what happened in the space around. But I also needed a way out. And it was sometime around then that I actually ended up down in Serre on the traces of Soutine, around 2000. There was a wonderful exhibition at the time about Soutine's Serre paintings in particular. Now, he's another painter who's very known for his portraits, but actually for me a lot of the more interesting work happens in the landscapes and his treatment of space and place, which is probably something that's come to the fore again in this particular exhibition, because again, talking about showing back here, it did feel important to me to think more specifically about the projection of place and space and the idealization of place that there is within painting, or can be.
So when you first started, so when you left the sort of figurative realm behind, and moved into this space of texture and colour and movement. Was it terrifying?
It was absolutely terrifying. I was letting go of absolutely. It was a leap into the void. And there were about 3 years when I was just making a mess, and I was terrified, and I was, if I let go of all this, what if anything is left? Letting go of that very much clearer subject. There's a lot I was letting go of in my life at the time as well. I mean, painting doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that was happening on lots of levels. But no, it was absolutely terrifying, and there was a period of about 3 years where I was feeling very lost and very unsure as to whether or not there would be something out the other side of this.
And so at that point, how did you realize that you had stumbled across, through all of this anxiety, into a form or a language that you felt had bones, that you could keep going with it? Because there's something very recognizable about your paintings as well. I can, recognize them from a great distance, I think. You've really got a very clear language, I think. And how
but again,
did you arrive
that's down to the doing, the very obsessive doing over years. It took a while for me to realise that I had reached a recognisable language. I wasn't aware at the time that I was very much following the paint in some ways. And I mean, that sense of somewhere I could keep going, I think I always had that from oil paint from the beginning. I had moments where I was lost, but there was always the sense that I know that, as I say, looking at painters like Auerbach, that's sort of the faith he gave me, and the fact that even at this point in time in art history, there was something very alive and new always to be done with oil paint.
Yeah. And all of your paintings, as you mentioned before, are painted wet on wet, alla prima, a very old technique in a way of creating things in oil paint. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how did you arrive at that way of creating images?
I arrived at that, again, it was a slightly gradual process, because the portrait paintings were very small and very thick and sludgy and would go on for months and be highly obsessive, and I'd usually mess them up at some point by overworking them. But as I started trying to work with the space around, I started working bigger, and then the brushes got bigger, and I realised sort of my fascination with the brush stroke itself. And that led to me working with much more liquid oil paint, and that again led me to going down on the ground at some point and working horizontally. So a lot of these were, as often in the studio, they're kind of micro decisions at the time that I didn't realise the extent to which they were then going to impact everything else. So it's something that came about, again, quite organically for me over years, rather than being, one particular decision. Again, once I'd started working very liquid oil paint, there's such a pleasure to that. I mean, you can get very lost in it, and everything can just become brown if you just, mix it long enough. But once you do reach that right level of control of pigment and liquidity of the paint, there's such a pleasure in working wet on wet, that to then go back into things and try and work on them again when they're dry becomes very difficult, but also doesn't have that coherence or cohesivity. And that's something that I realise is also quite important to me, is that unity of time and space, of everything needing to come together and be quite coherent, is actually important to me. Again, the edges are part of that integrity. There was a lovely text I came across at the time that someone mentioned to me about, because they were talking about folds, and it was the David Bone text about the implicate order and the notions of space and time being in folds. And actually, sort of his subtext to that was wholeness, the notion of wholeness, and how unfashionable that had become, that notion of integrity, that we're in a society now that's very dispersed, and that actually wholeness is something to be aspired to rather than rejected. And that's something that spoke to me on quite a deep level.
I'm afraid I haven't read him, but he's a physicist, isn't he?
He's a quantum physicist, but who also wrote a lot of very dumbed-down things for the likes of me about creativity.
Right, okay. So what do you mean wholeness in that sense?
That sense of, I think that the sense of integrity of something being, not split up into process and then surface and then look and then, but he also talks about it in the way of being as a human being, of trying to have acts that have meaning that as a person we are not just divided up into you can't separate up what you say and what you do, and that it should all actually be coherent, and integrity, I think, is the word.
There's a great sense of movement, and a sort of baroque almost sense of movement, I think, in your work. It feels like it's full of speed and colour and life, and something very rapidly is happening. Now, you make these, you were saying before, at flat, so they're not. You don't see them until they're finished and when they're upright. And so why do you choose to create works like that, flat on the ground?
Well, as I said, the working flat on the ground really came about because of the liquidity of the paint and
because
otherwise it would all just be drips. Yeah. So it has to be done in that way in order to be able to work that way. It creates a very different dynamic. Again, I hadn't taken that on board when I started working that way quite how much. It's an extremely immersive way of working. Again, back to the notion of sort of integrity. It's very, very immersive. You sort of almost become part of the work yourself. You're working sort of almost within it. Whereas when you're working upright, it's kind of like a window. It's something you can step back from much more easily. This does require sort of really being in the field, in the operating field with the work and fully engaging with it physically. It also does put certain limitations. Obviously, the most obvious one being the format, the size. I can only reach so far. So the maximum sort of work I'm going to be doing is probably 2 meters by 150 or 160 because of quite simply being able to reach the center at ease without too much in the way of gymnastics. And that also, again, had the consequence of, it's almost a Vitruvian Man thing of obviously then being, 1-to-1 maximum in terms of the format, which in turn, when I decided I needed to work bigger, which came about when I did the show at the Rothko Museum a few years ago, led me to working in diptychs and triptychs, which again brought me to various other plays that I found interesting. It's yet another folding out, so we're back to, as much as there's folding in and out within each canvas, that's another folding out of the space. It obviously has art historical antecedents as well in terms of altarpieces, so we're, back to my dear Italians again. So there's all that involved in it. It also has the play of being able to be between both portrait and landscape formats, and that's something that interests me as well. I tended to, for the single panel works, usually avoid landscape formats, just because the way the human brain works, we tend to reach for the easiest reading of things, and the work being as abstract as it is, if you've got a landscape format, you're going to very quickly look for the horizon line. Whereas by flipping that to portrait format, it's no doubt a leftover as well from my original years of portrait painting, but it is also a way of making the mind perhaps, take two, think again, not have that easy reading. Obviously, when I'm working with diptychs and triptychs, there's the double reading going on. They're both portrait and landscape. That interests me.
And what kind of preparation do you do beforehand? Do you do sketches? Do you know what kind of colours you're going to be using? Do you have a vague idea of what the work is, or does it evolve in the making?
It does evolve in the making. The preparation is several layers, as thin as possible, that have to go down and dry before I start, because once I'm working wet on wet, I don't want to drag through to the white. So I do need something that's down there. Generally speaking, as in, most painting tends to be either light to dark or dark to light. So those first layers do have an importance afterwards, but they're not completely determinate on what's going to happen. These days I've learned to go into the studio without too much intention beyond actually getting on with work. Quite simply because I've learned over the years that often too much intention kills a painting, but also, with the best intentions, quite often a lot comes into the studio slightly unbidden. There's a lot that appears in the paintings that I had been unaware that I was thinking of, or that have just, I went a few years ago, it was a sort of fairly obvious example. I went to Rome thinking Tintoretto because I was very much looking at Tintoretto at the time, and when I came back I was sort of surprised to find that the first painting I did when I came back, that actually it was Caravaggio who'd snuck in, and kind of
And had you been really thinking a lot about Caravaggio?
No, I hadn't been aware of. No, yeah,
Right.
a bit of a thief in the night. I think he was.
Yes, he literally
yes,
was.
literally was,
Yeah.
wasn't he? But it's not always as highbrow or as high church as that. It can also be, Dr. Seuss or, Looney Tunes or all sorts of other things that also come in terms of colour and shape. And again, it's about being in the moment and attentive to the moment, but also, also attentive to the surprises that can happen, and I'm glad they do. That's
I'm always very interested in this sort of process when, obviously you're a deeply intellectual reader and writer and thinker and maker of things, but at the same time, intuition is very important to you. And is that something you think about a lot, intuition? And you allow yourself to go places?
That's the beauty of it. I think had I carried on the route
Mm.
of wanting to write, I would have driven myself mad. I'm such an obsessive. You can always go back and correct. And again, the way I work now, I think, it forces me to be very much in the moment and to just get, to be doing. De Kooning had that lovely expression about painting being like crossing the road, and there is that thing of you can think it and plan it, and but at some point you've just got to, with all that you know and have understood of and the cars you've seen coming or whatever, at some point you've just got to go, you've just got to do.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, so that leap into the void, the trust that you will land somewhere, that something will start happening that will then take over. But that's the beauty of it, is for me, trying to shut off the monkey mind, all the intellectual stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. In something you wrote, I was reading your notes on the plane coming here, and you talked about abstraction being a form of dislocation. And of course, abstraction is it has different meanings for different cultures, for different, every person who looks at it will have a different relationship to it. But what did you mean by that, a form of dislocation?
I said displacement.
Displacement.
Not dislocation.
Ooh.
I think that's going back to quite simply the etymology of the word abstract. To abstract is to pull at one remove. It is to literally put at one step away. And I feel that my work is in some ways very purely, in terms of that purely etymological sense of the word abstract, that is very much what I am doing. The work is clearly organic. It's to do with nature and to do with the human and to do with movement, and yet it is at one remove. I was talking to my mathematician son the other night, and he said, well, I know what an abstract is, and it's also taking something out of context, the better to ascertain its true nature. Whether or not I manage to ascertain anything's true nature is another question, but certainly it's that sense of being at a remove. And I think that it's that awareness. That is what painting in any case is. Probably any art form is to a certain extent. You're at a remove. We're not aping reality. We are taking a step away from it, the better to examine it or express something about it.
Well, you're creating a new reality.
Yes, that's again the beauty of it. Well, except in my case, I hope that is evocative of things that are familiar to people, or feelings at least that are familiar.
This is a sort of awkward question, but you talked before about abstraction being, or your abstraction being a kind of universal language. And what do you mean by that exactly? What kind of universal ideas are you communicating?
I'm not sure I'm communicating universal ideas. I'm a believer in communication of feeling and of emotion, as romantic as that may sound. It's more that, quite simply, a good painting, just like music, doesn't require precise analysis in order to have an effect, to convey something to someone. The show I did at the Rothko Centre was called Onomatopoeia, and it's that sense of, for me, just as an onomatopoeic word, there is that sense that a good painting will communicate something very directly, almost to the gut or to the nervous system, without requiring that analysis, that intellectual analysis.
In a way that music does.
In a way that music does.
So it's art aspiring to the quality of music in a way.
Except painting's got an added thing.
Yeah.
Painting's extraordinary amongst the arts in the sense that it has a really particular relationship to time. Virtually every other art form has a linearity of time at some point in both the doing and the receiving. And I mean, obviously painting does in the doing. You need a certain time to paint a painting. But what you're delivering up at the end is a piece of work where all those moments are both, or potentially can be immediately seen, and yet you can also then spend an infinite time, so almost like an accordion, pulling that out again. There's this extraordinary relationship to time within painting that doesn't exist in any other art form.
I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on colour and what determines the colours that you decide to use for a painting.
Oh gosh, that's so much influences that I'm not even aware of. You know, with the weather outside. I mean, yes, there are colours I'm particularly drawn to. There's again those questions of intuition. I'm wary of that word intuition or instinct, because at this point in time it's intuition or instinct fed by 30 plus years of doing and of knowing how things are going to work out or not, or what will end in just, as I said earlier, brown sludge, or what will actually... there's also, very, very obvious questions of sort of economy and technique. In the last 5, 7, 8 years, probably, I've been working more with the cadmiums, and the colours have got brighter in a lot of the works, and that's partly down to economy, in the sense that working as wet on wet as I do, you need really good pigments in order for the strong colours to hold, and the cadmiums are notoriously expensive. So, there's all those stories about people like Auerbach painting in nothing but brown for the first years, just because those are the cheaper colours. So, it's something that's not often talked about, but there is that does come into it. Again, I think at this point in time, visual images are everywhere, and we're bombarded the whole time by so much visually. It's very hard to separate up what colours mean. So many colours do evoke specific things. And I'd say the most obvious answer is, of course, yes, I've always looked to the Italians, and there is something, no doubt, because I'm also starting with some quite earthy tones. There's those Umbra and Sienna literally are, the Italian colours. But it's very variable, really. It also comes back to that thing of being attentive to what's happening on the canvas, and quite often where I think I've got somewhere but it feels too complacent, I will actually then throw in something that's kind of a bit of a curveball in terms of a very different colour to wake the whole thing up. I mean, it comes down to a lot, I think for a lot of painters, we're trying not to kill the paint in the studio.
Do you mix your own paints? You don't get them pre-mixed? Or?
No, I buy them pre-mixed, but then I have these big Mason's tubs where I then mix up, from.
And how swiftly do you do the pictures? Like, do you work on them for weeks or months, or do they?
No, I can't. They literally, the way I work means I
Yeah.
have a maximum of a day or two for that final iteration to come together, or not. So, someone wants to call it sudden death painting, and there is, there is that. It's got to, at some point, all coalesce together or not. That said, at the end of any one day, I can wipe out the whole thing, and I can still usually do that the next morning, depending on the time of year and the weather. So there is that moment of, just as there's pentimenti in Italian, the French have that word repentir, which both means to repent, but also to repaint. There's always time for that. And, and not everything, again, I think all painters have those moments. You think you've done something extraordinary or something alive, and then you come in the studio the next morning and think, either that died in the night, or I don't know what I was thinking yesterday. And, even once things are dry, I do, because of the way I work, I then edit a lot. So, but once it's dry, that is a question of box cutter, restretch, start again. I always love talking about artists' influences, and I'd love to hear more about, you talk about the Italians. So which ones in particular? You're talking about Renaissance Italians. Oh, yes. I mean, I think my first love was probably very early Renaissance, but really one of the painters, there was that thing when I was sort of 18, 19, when I was loving the idea of Pat's painting, but feeling, do I have anything to say? And so I think it was really those artists like, late Titian, seeing what he was doing in the flaying of Marsyas, for example, that thing of paint as flesh, that, as I say, that very kind of golem-like thing of actually that alchemy of trying to bring something alive that I was looking at, twinned with someone like Auerbach working back in London, and how alive he could just make a brush mark. It was those painters that brought me to painting, because I think in those early years I did have that absolute sort of, you know, nonsense arrogance at some level to think that I could make something alive. You know, there were a few years later I read that this wonderful collection of texts by the Danish artist Per Kirkeby, in which he says something about the fundamental dishonesty of painting, that it's about trickery and lies, and I thought, well, of course it is, and of course that's all we can aspire to be doing. At the end of the day, you know, nothing's going to come alive. It's and that does open up worlds of other painters, and the ways in which we use that and respond to it. And so there's so many, you know, wonderful Italian painters that I go back to again and again. I mean, Italy itself, you know, the way as well that painting is so immersive there, that painting is everywhere. And that immersivity is very important to me in many ways. But there's also very different painters I'm drawn to quite often, who go about that sort of liminality of space, or that creating of a different space or a different universe, and who play around with that in much more literary or figurative ways. I mean, I love Gertrude Abercrombie. You know, lucky to have Cara Turing in my studio building, and I love her work. Or, you know, there's painters who are incredibly playful with an almost literary way of working that sort of really speaks to me as well.
It might be a good moment actually to talk about a sense of place. The wonderful display on the other side of the gallery, where Erin has chosen works from Highlands Gallery to sort of work alongside, well, to complement your work on some level, I guess. And so what determined your choices there? How did you make this final decision?
Well, when Aoife asked me if I wanted to curate the part of the municipal collection at Highlands, I started looking at the works in the collection, and because I'd by that point started to, you know, not just work on, but close down some of the decisions of my own works coming, and was thinking very much about painting as a space of projection, but also the possibility of projection of space and place and idealization, it seemed obvious to me that there was that particular thread in Irish painting of place as an ideal, of that very romantic notion of Ireland that has actually at times been, you know, quite politicized as well. The Celtic revival and the whole sense of those wonderful Irish landscape painters who had been, you know, I mean, at the same time, Ireland lends itself particularly well to that idealization, having the landscapes it does. What was very interesting to me quickly was to see the different directions that took me within the collection. Unfortunately, there's one painting that didn't make it here because I think the people of Drogheda wouldn't have allowed it, which was the lead painting in the selection at Highlands, which is by an Italian called Ricciardelli, which is a painting of Drogheda that sort of owes as much to the Bay of Naples probably as it does to Drogheda, which was kind of a wonderful reminder as well of displacements of populations in both directions, that it wasn't just the Irish who were going out into the world in the diaspora, but also other people coming from other places and projecting their fantasies or ideals onto Ireland as well. Let's say, unfortunately, that painting hasn't made it here to Galway. You'll have to go to Drogheda to see it, which I invite you to do. And similarly, to then sort of find this wonderful piece by a younger artist, Fiona Kirby, called To Valparaiso, which is the small sort of relic that's there, which is, I think, a remnant of a shipwreck of people who were, again, trying to travel to an elsewhere, to an ideal. In a different way. There's, you know, the Nano Reed's paint box, which seemed to me to sum up the possibility of painting to travel, but also to take and create worlds wherever you go. So it was very organic as a selection, but there was obviously that theme of you know, the ideal landscape in Ireland. And then I did also want to bring in some of those other dialogues in the more contemporary or the more modern selection, leading through to contemporary. It was Diana Copperwhite who was here, who was responsible for introducing me to Aoife, and it's thanks to her that in many ways I'm here today, in parts. I wanted to include her work, and she and I have had long dialogues over recent years about that cross-fertilization, that there is between all the visual arts of different countries, but particularly European and New York, but also for herself as an artist growing up in Ireland, looking both to Hans Hofmann in New York, but also to the modernist tradition. And in Ireland, when I was studying art history, I was very aware of Mainie Jellett and Evie Hone, perhaps more so than many people at the time. There's the current exhibition in the National Gallery, as two women who were sort of among the first modernists in Ireland, but who had travelled to Paris and worked under André Lotte and Albert Glaise. Likewise, I fell across Roderick O'Connor, who was, with Gauguin in Brittany, and those notions of dialogue between the visual arts here and elsewhere felt very important to me, and to bring that last selection in. The very last painting is one by Michael Farrell, who was a friend of mine and very much one of my mentors in Paris, and an Irish artist who lived in France for much of his life. And that's a little painting I've just gifted to the Highlanes, which is of Picasso and Joyce sitting in the Café de Flore. And the story behind that was, back to the universality of painting, was that they didn't have a common language between them. So Picasso was sitting there making little sculptures out of matchbooks for Joyce to amuse him while they were in the Café de Flore together. So again, that was a moment for me that sort of summarised in some ways those dialogues between countries. Again, questions of displacement though as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is your first major exhibition in Ireland.
Yes.
And what does that mean to you in terms of your heritage and your father?
It means a lot. Various of my father's siblings are here today, which also means a lot to me. I'm sure it would mean a lot to him. It's an unexpected gift at this point. I didn't necessarily ever expect to show back in Ireland, and I'm very, very grateful to, obviously, Aoife, but also the Galway Arts Festival for welcoming this here and giving us such an extraordinary venue to show the work. And thank you to you as well for coming to talk. Wonderful.